The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised.
Oh, how I wonder what it's like to relax. See the sky down under. Hope my plans collapse. Oh, how I'm under the surface of my tears, falling down asunder the meaning of my years.
This is True Crime XS.
So today's visitor is an author named Jim Obermeyer. Now, Jim is a veteran criminal courts journalist and legal administrator. He has taken his courthouse experience and he has combined that with a long-standing passion for baseball history to author books in both genres. His latest book is the book that we're going to be talking about tonight. It's called The Electrocution of Baby Lawrence, and it revives a notorious murder case from the 1940s. It stayed in the headlines. It gripped newspaper readers from coast to coast. It was truly a national story. It's the account of the death of a 6-month-old, highly disabled baby that could have been an accident, it could have been a murder, or potentially it could have been a mercy killing. By day, Jim was a reporter for the Berkshire Eagle up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And later on, he was an administrator for the district attorney's office there, as well as for the New York State Office of Court Administration, which is in Albany. His lifelong interest in baseball included the Negro Leagues, which were the black major leagues that existed prior to Major League integration in 1947. He wrote biography of Effa Manley, who was one of the owners of the Newark Eagles, and it was called Queen of the Negro Leagues. She is one of 37 black baseball figures and the only woman from any baseball background elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. I believe that's still true, isn't it, Jim?
Yes.
His other works include, am I saying it right when I say Cum Posey of the Homestead Grays?
Yes. Cumberland Posey was the owner of the Homestead Grays, yes.
And that's another prominent Negro League baseball team. He was a basketball star in his youth, and he was one of only 2 people that were elected to 2 American Professional Sports Halls of Fame. And then you also wrote The Black Ball on the Boardwalk, right?
Yes.
So that's a history of the Black Atlantic City Bacharach Giants team. So they would have been for the 1920s. I think you've also contributed to or written in Shades of Glory, which would have been a history of black baseball in America. And you were an editor or are an editor of Black Ball, which is a scholarly journal of black baseball history.
Correct.
All right. So this case that you have, first of all, it's a great book. I loved it. Meg, did you have any thoughts on the book?
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the way that it was very factually captivating. I felt like I was experiencing the trial as it was happening. And I really enjoyed that level of detail when we talk about cases.
That is one of my favorite things. Like, I love following trials. So I have to ask, how did you get wind of this case to start out?
Well, I went to work for the Berkshire Eagle in 1972 as the bureau chief in an outlying bureau in Berkshire County. But I really wanted to be the police and criminal courts reporter. I had done that before, working my way through college by chasing ambulances and then going to class. And when the opening came up in 1974, I grabbed it, or they grabbed me, or whatever. Courthouse, the way courthouse cases proceed, it's not Law and Order on television where things go bang, bang, bang. There's a lot of downtime. You sit around, the judges in chambers talking to the attorneys, the judges probably working on some other case that hasn't got anything to do with us. And so you sit around. And the old timers, and at that point, the court officers were mostly guys who'd been around for years, bailiffs, really. And some of the lawyers, would come through and they'd talk about famous cases in Berkshire County. Not that there were all that many of them. It was a small county. And they talked about the Knoxon case. Oh, that's interesting. So I looked it up, and it was interesting. And eventually I started to pick away at it, do a little research. Well, it had been a big enough case in its day, 1944, that the local library, the Berkshire Athenaeum, the historical section even someone had made a card file of every local newspaper article about the case, 3.5 by 3 by 5 cards. So that was a good start. So I'm slowly assembling my information and doing my regular job, and then getting married and raising family. And so this thing sort of cruised along under the surface, writing those other books. But in the process, I got acquainted with one of the daughters of the trial judge, Abraham Pinansky. She'd been a reporter for the Boston Globe. She understood the relevance and the value of documents. And she had the judge's copy of the entire trial transcript in a box in a closet in her house. And she was not going to just toss it out, but she would dearly love to give it away to someone to give it a better home. Well, that was me.
Well, that's like a roadmap that becomes like a journey to take at that point.
Yeah, well, she lived I'm at the far end of the state, almost to the New York line, and she lived in a suburb of Boston. So in that day, it was a road journey. The district attorney, Charles Alberti, had a son, Charles Jr., who became a lawyer like his dad and became a judge like his dad. And when he became a judge, he had to be a full-time judge and close his law practice. So he sold it to a friend of mine who had been a public defender and then worked in the DA's office with me and was our lawyer too, to top it off. Not that we gave him much business, but he's fascinated by the case. And he comes to me one day and says, I bought everything that Charlie Alberti had up for sale, including this box of documents in the basement of the building that looked like they came his father's stuff from the Knoxon trial. He says, I don't think I can give it to you, but you can copy anything you want. So zoom, went to copier. I had memos, I had affidavits that Alberti had signed, motions and his affidavits and affidavits of other people involving motions. And there were a lot of motions in this case, before and after, I can tell you. So now I've got all this stuff and I start to write, but we'll get into it. This is a case with a lot of aspects. This is not, and it just kept coming out like a court reporter hack trial story, and I knew there was more to it than that. You had the fact, the victim was a 6-month-old boy with Down syndrome, and you had politics involved, and you had class divides involved at a time in Massachusetts when that was a big deal. So it was a struggle. I kept putting it down, and I wrote the other books, and we moved to Arizona, and I brought everything in a bunch of boxes, and I looked at those boxes in my closet in my office one day and said, you got to write this book. So I did.
How many, like, if you had to ballpark it, how many pages do you think you accumulated in the research for this book?
Well, the case mistrial partway through and was tried again to completion, so that the combined transcript is about 2,000 double-spaced 8 by 11 pages right there. I've got 2 banker's boxes full of files, stuff that I mostly newspaper stories, but some other things too, some letters from people that I corresponded with, a few of them, and transcripts of interviews with a couple of key people, particularly Judge Alberti's son, who gave me a long interview in his retirement after being a judge. I don't know. It's a lot of stuff. It's still there.
Well, I'll tell you what, it shows in the writing. So, like you mentioned, there's a lot of interesting factors to this story. And I will say this, as far as your writing style, it definitely shows how much practice you got with the other books as you were putting all this together. It has almost a Dickensian feel, like Charles Dickens style. The setting is almost a character here. Like, it's such an interesting, like, old American setting. It almost feels like it's Victorian or like something out of like this like amazing old Renaissance novel. And it's taking place in Massachusetts. Like you said, there's a mistrial. So it takes place over this period of time. It's like everything is frozen for about 7 years and you kind of can see it all. Did you personally have a favorite element of this case?
I kept coming back. I mean, the case itself, of course, is fascinating. There's a lot of scientific evidence, medical evidence. It's an electrocution case. That's not completely easy to prove. It's not like a smoking wire, but it's a little different. I became fascinated with it by the major people involved, and in fact, for better or for worse, early in the book, I stopped the timeline and I just give little biographies of these guys because they're so fascinating. I mean, if this was a novel, the hero would be Charles Alberti, the district attorney, who came to America as a first-generation immigrant from Sicily at age 12. His father died. His mother she's probably worthy of a book in and of herself. She raised 5 kids, made sure they all went to school, sent them off to work to support the family. Charlie delivered newspapers with his brother John, and he did all of these things and finished high school at Pittsfield High School, decided he wanted to go to college. Well, the family is, barely got 2 quarters to rub together. He goes up to Williams College, which is an elite, I'd say, a liberal arts school, small liberal arts school north of Pittsfield, up in the very corner of Massachusetts. This is the family story anyway. It's been told to me and to some other people. Hung around the main building, and the dean of the college spotted him and said, "So who are you?" He says, "Well, my name is Charles Alberti. I'm from Pittsfield. I'd really like to go to your college, but I don't have any money." And the dean says, "Well, if you can pass the entrance exam, we'll find you a scholarship." So he passed the entrance exam, and he's a student at Williams. He's still got to support himself and send money home because now he's not delivering papers and doing odd jobs. So he's got a bunch of different jobs. He manages the dry cleaners, and he's a waiter. But his big money maker is, in those days, Williams would give their students a room, but they wouldn't give them but you didn't get any furniture. You had to buy your own furniture. So Charlie would buy these suites of student furniture from graduating seniors, store them over the summer, and sell them at a markup to freshmen in the fall. And he made, by his account, about $2,000, some of which he sent home and some of which he kept because the next step was to go to Harvard Law School. And he got in and he completed his degree. He came back to Pittsfield, the first Italian-American lawyer in Pittsfield, and he handled cases and got in a business with 2 partners where they catered to new immigrants helped them with real estate and other problems, and helped them buy steamship tickets so they could bring the rest of the family over. And he also got into politics. He was the city attorney for a while. Then he decided he wanted to succeed on his own. So he ran for district attorney in 1942. And Pittsfield, Berkshire County at the time was twinned up with a much larger county, Hamden County, where Springfield, Mass. Is located. And that was the district attorney's district, prosecutorial district. So Berkshire County is the little part of the district. Springfield is full of many more voters. They're also full of a lot of Democrats, and Charlie was a Republican. So as his son told me, I got in the car with him every weekend, and we went down to picnics and knocking on doors and clam bakes and everything you could think of, while he made himself known to the people around Springfield. They held the election, and he won by less than 1%. He was the district attorney. This is the first murder case, and as far as I can tell, the only murder case he ever tried. And he was thorough at it. And so he's the guy who didn't let this case slide. This case could have been written off, and originally the night of the death was essentially written off as a mercy killing. And between Alberti and John L. Sullivan, a great name for a police chief, the police chief of Pittsfield, they resuscitated the case the next day and brought murder charges against John Noxon, the most prominent lawyer, one of the most prominent lawyers in Pittsfield, and saw the case all the way through.
It's interesting. I wondered how you had backgrounded these characters to make them so robust and have so much depth. And now you've given us kind of a window into how you did that. You also pointed out, there's a lot of really interesting firsts in this case, in terms of Pittsfield, the area itself, and then kind of for the nation with this young child dying and it being written off as a mercy killing, and then it coming back and being essentially a capital case in some regards. The story stands alone, but you got to have all this information about a couple of the characters. How did you approach the rest of the characters and digging into their life? Was it the observations of who you could get a hold of, or how did you approach particularly the defendant here? And why did you decide to balance them so equally against each other in terms of the story?
Because I found they all had outstanding attributes, both professional and personal. I mean, Noxon even had professional attributes. Personally, we can talk about later, not such a great guy. But this was the only case in which the DA, the lead defense attorney, the judge, and the defendant were all graduates of the Harvard Law School. Only murder case were graduates of the Harvard Law School. Well, Judge Pinansky, I told about his daughter giving me the transcript. Her sister, who had grown up, become a social worker, and they told me a lot about their dad, who was second generation American, the second Jewish judge to be appointed to the Superior Court in Massachusetts. He was Harvard Law and undergrad. He did his undergrad in 3 years, and then he went to law school. And he was following in the footsteps of his father. He became a leader in the not-for-profit public benefit situation in Boston. He was on the boards of libraries and hospitals, and he was the president of the Hebrew Free Loan Society. He was at his funeral. The streets outside of the temple, where his synagogue, where his funeral was being held, were clogged with 3,000 people who came to the funeral but couldn't get in. So that's Abe Pinansky was pretty well known. His family was very helpful, even at the point of writing the book. Lent me photos, and one of them had a copy of the notebook their father kept during the trial, or their grandfather in this case kept during the trial, and he scanned the whole thing, 90 some pages, sent it to me. Joe Ely was the chief defense attorney. He was a former governor of the state, two-term governor of the state, and a good lawyer. So there's plenty to find out about him. You can crack open several books and find out about Joseph Buell Ely, who was a very, very wealthy man. You had a very wealthy guy whose first ancestor in America came to the country in 1600s and was in fact one of the founders of the city in the town of Hartford, Connecticut. So you've got blue blood Ely, you've got blue blood John Knoxon, whose family came to Long Island not too long after Nathan Ely landed in Hartford, and you've got first generation Charlie Alberti, and you've got John Sullivan, who's a classic Irish cop, second generation Irishman. So you've got this ethnic divide, which was in fact becoming very prominent in Pittsfield and in Massachusetts. European immigrants were becoming very important economically and very important politically. So you've got a little trace of that in this trial too. And I can't say that affected the outcome of the trial, but clearly there's not a lot of friendship between the prosecutorial and defense side. Sometimes attorneys have known each other for years and they get along well, even if they're on their opposite sides. You could not catch that at all from the transcript.
In the book, you could see some of the early, I don't want to call them stereotypes, but they kind of are like stereotypical Massachusetts divides in the politics. With this having like so much to do with all these affluent people and these like early, things that now, like this was kind of the foundational time for a lot of interesting, later conflict. And we've also, it's a different time for the death penalty. It's a very different time for the developmentally disabled and people with all sorts of disorders, let alone Down syndrome. Was there anything in this story that, like, when you read it, it just like shocked you?
It was very hard to get my head around the whole business of Down syndrome. I mean, I was perfectly aware it existed, but the way the kids were disregarded in those days, and this, in fact, was getting over that was a major roadblock to tying this whole thing together. That Down syndrome children, well, they weren't even called Down syndrome, they were called mongoloids. And even the medical experts who testified diagnosed him as Mongolism. And in the regular vernacular, not only were they called Mongolians, but they were called Mongolian idiots because they didn't have full mental faculties. It's and scientific studies at the time said, our statistics show that a Mongolian child isn't going to live past his or her middle teens. They're never going to be able to economically or, amount to anything. And there were basically three options. You could keep the child at home, and almost no one was advised to do that. You could find what we would now call maybe a group home for them, or you could put them in an institution. Well, the institution in Massachusetts was the Belchertown State School, which had been founded and called in the 19th century and originally called the School for the Feeble-Minded, which gives you kind of an idea of how it saw its mission. And it wasn't a very nice place. And it wasn't the Knoxons' certainly level of place. They were strongly advised not to keep the child at home because they had a 15-year-old son who was away in prep school at the time, but of course he was coming home. And keeping keeping a mongoloid baby around the house, child around the house, the medical expert said was a sure path to family disruption. So it's extremely sad.
Yeah, it kind of puts, in a weird way, it kind of puts the option of murder on the table. Like that's going to be a better way to
Well,
to solve family dysfunction, you know. And it was an interesting point in the trial. I don't know exactly what the word I'm looking for there is. It becomes a characteristic how they treat this child, and I had to remind myself several times this was a 6-month-old baby.
yes.
So I had a couple of experiences in my own life, and this story was actually the very first time that I was able to draw a link. And I had no idea that children who we now consider to have Down syndrome were so disregarded just, 60 years ago. And it was like a puzzle coming together. And I was like, I'm so glad that I got to understand that, because some of the most fascinating things that I have found are from the early Supreme Court, from medical experts, and it was because they didn't know any better, right? They were literally just going off of what they knew at the time. There is nothing about a child with Down syndrome that lends towards any of the characteristics that some of the medical experts at this time were talking about then. And I had never put the two together. And if we don't know that, and know, but because now it doesn't come up, and when it does come up, people don't know. Like I had no idea that it was such a stigma. And so I learned that from this, and it finally filled in like a little piece of the puzzle I was missing, because I had no idea it was an issue. And I feel like that's because history repeats itself if you don't learn the first time. And so with a variety of things, I feel like that is very beneficial to our society to keep it in mind, I guess would be the best way to put it.
I have a question. I don't know if you did this on purpose or not, but electricity becomes a theme in this. Was that orchestrated? Like, did you plan that?
No one really knows for sure, but they said at the time, this is the first case in Massachusetts, a murder case where electricity was the murder weapon. Well, who knows if that's true? But at least there probably hadn't been very many.
Not in terms of murder. Like at that point,
Yeah.
most electricity cases
Were accidental deaths.
they were accidental deaths. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, that was John Noxon's theory of the case. It was a household accident,
But 6-month-old babies, they're not mobile, really.
No, that was part of the problem.
I feel like electricity would not be the friendliest weapon as far as what somebody would use, right?
No.
Well, the case, so electricity was the means of death, accidental or deliberate. Pittsfield at the time was a General Electric town before the factories there shut down. The town had maybe 55,000 people living in it, and GE had, during World War II, had reached almost 12,000 employees. Not all of them came from Pittsfield, but you can see what a driver it was to the local economy. Noxon, who practiced civil law, was outside counsel to GE and other electric companies, manufacturing companies. And if he were convicted, he's going to the electric chair.
Right.
It's all about electricity.
Right. Yeah. And like, it was so fascinating. I read it, and then after reading the book, I came back to it, and I was like, he did this. He set this all up so that we were thinking about the electricity of it all, like the whole time. And I found that to be such an interesting theme and arc for the story. You know, we covered lots of court cases. We do talk to authors occasionally, but like the truth is most books don't keep our attention in a way that like we really want to tell people about it. This one did for a number of reasons. And I don't want to give away anything here in terms of, I want people to read this book. In fact, I was telling Meg this, and it pops in my head when I've read a really good book. I want to see a limited series, like with all of this playing out, because it's such an awesome setting. And it is like a really well told story with all these sort of intricate, elevated society folks having to battle out a murder case. And like, you don't see that in the court a lot. And I think it would just be absolutely fascinating. But do you think that, like, your personal opinion, do you think that John Noxon is a murderer?
Well, I mean, I sat through, I don't know how many trials, murder and otherwise, covering them. And I never try to second guess a jury. I mean, they're up there in that room and they may see things the way different from the way we're seeing them hanging around the courtroom doing our jobs. But there's one thing, and I think that, you know, that Lawrence's pediatrician was called to the house. He saw the baby dead. He called the local medical examiner, Albert England, who came over. And they bought John Noxon's story that it was an accidental electrocution because the lad got his arm entangled in a defective extension cord while John was trying to repair a radio. And this is 1944. A radio is about half the size of a VW Beetle. So you would need a light. You would need to get, down and look inside it and all of that. But, and they went away, and they were convinced, and they went away. And England, I don't know if he stayed up all night feeling guilty or whatever, but he flagged Chief Sullivan down the next morning downtown, told him the story, and Sullivan went out to the house, and it was a little suspicious, and there was some sparring with Noxon, and Sullivan wasn't at all happy that Noxon had thrown the extension cord in the house incinerator, and Noxon said, it was defective. I didn't want anybody in the family near it, and my wife would be very upset, so I burned it. Because, hey, it was an accident, right? So Sullivan goes to the funeral home and a body. They talk about the prime time in a homicide investigation is the first 24 hours before people get their stories straight and evidence disappears or goes astray. Well, almost all of that 24 hours had gone by before the police even had a notion of what was going on. And the body had been taken away from the scene to the funeral home. So Sullivan goes to the funeral home and he sees what the jury eventually saw by way of evidentiary photos. The boy has got a burn. He's got burns on both arms, but he's got a burn on his left forearm that is 2 inches long, 1.75 inches wide. The state pathologist testified it was about 1/8 of an inch deep. He described getting a good line in, I guess, before anybody could stop him. He described the skin as looking cooked. And there's no way that could have come from a contact with 3 or 4 minutes. The Noxon was out of the room, carelessly, as he put it, with an extension cord that had a couple of breaks in it, insulation breaks that were 1 inch wide or less. And I think the jury saw those photos, and they said the same thing that John Sullivan and Charles Alberti said: this is not possibly an accidental death. If you want, the defense had, in a private capacity, their chief medical witness was Milton Halpern, who at that time was the deputy chief medical examiner of the city of New York, later famously became the chief medical examiner. And Halpern testified, and Halpern wrote his memoirs later, and years later, and he thought Noxon was innocent. But he said in another chapter, he said something, sometimes when juries are bombarded with all of this medical and scientific evidence from both sides, they disregard it because they can't figure out which side is the true side, and they seize upon other things. And I think the jury saw that photo of little Lawrence's left forearm and said, this cannot be an accident. And the only option left was murder, manslaughter, for reasons. There'd been a case, a recent Supreme Judicial Court case that overturned a manslaughter conviction. And when Judge Panansky read through it, the case was only about a month old. He said, look, the fact pattern is the same, and manslaughter is not an appropriate possible verdict for the jury. So it's murder first or murder second. And the jury said, well, murder first.
Yeah.
Now, would you believe that, having read your book, I think it's possible that he was innocent? And I don't question the jury's outcome either, because, like you said, they sit through the trial and they make the best decision they can based on the information that's put before them. I was absolutely fascinated that you put a picture of the jury walking to the court. And that's not how I pictured them to be at all, but it made a lot of sense to me. And so I don't question the jury's verdict and the work that they put into the case. But I wondered if I think about it, this little area, which I know that they were sort of new in their career. I don't know how far into his career the district attorney was, but I know that this was his first murder trial, right? And I wondered, because a lot of times in life, when you're doing very important work, you end up almost being overtrained. And I wouldn't want to second guess their professional opinions, but there was a little bit to it to me, and the way that you told the story. It didn't make me think that John Noxon wasn't capable of killing his son, but it made me think that he probably really loved his wife. And even with the alternatives the way they were for society's view of children that had Down syndrome at the time, like, he had alternatives available to him besides killing the child, or mercy, putting the child out of its misery, mercy killing, whatever you would like to call it. And it seemed to me like he really loved his wife and his wife really loved him. And it's possible it could have been an accident. And again, I wouldn't question the jury's decision, but the picture that the jury sort of, your impression was that they kind of locked onto that as far as like that couldn't possibly accidentally have happened. In my experience, babies can do all kinds of things that are completely unexplainable. I didn't see the picture, so I don't really know. But have you considered that at all?
Well, I tried to be as even-handed as possible. In fact, I tried to, in writing a book, I tried to think of, in writing a jacket copy and PR copy, are there ways to talk about this in a public relations or a catchy way that don't show how it comes out?
Sure.
And then I think, oh, well, there's a table of contents in the front. Never mind. This is too much. This is too much spy work. But yeah, I think that the look at the burn turned John Sullivan from a somewhat suspicious but not hell-bent character from somebody who stormed back to the house from the funeral home, and all of a sudden it's clear he's got a murder case. He says, John Noxon, I think you killed your son. I think you murdered your son. He's just like flipping a switch. But the defense witnesses come and go. They get hired. The professional witnesses, the expert witnesses, they get hired. They do their testimony. They leave, and that is generally last you've seen of them. Halperin devoted a whole chapter of this case years later, like 30 years later, to the Noxon case, and he still swears that Noxon was innocent. Noxon was railroaded. Halperin was a total New York City guy, public schools, City College in New York, Medical College in New York, worked for a New York hospital, worked for the city medical. I don't know if he took a vacation, he must have crossed the city line at some point, but he's a New York City guy. And he thought these people from Massachusetts were just barely out of the Salem witch hunt era. They were railroading John Noxon. And this is late. I mean, he didn't have to do this. This guy had tons of famous cases to write about, and he's devoted a whole chapter to this case. His co-expert witness, one was a guy named Dr. Charles Lund, who was on the Harvard Medical School faculty, and he was a burn expert. He'd started a burn trial at Boston City Hospital just during the World War II at the request of the military, I think, so they could treat burns better. And smack in the middle of his work is the Coconut Grove fire, a nightclub with blocked exits and flammable this and flammable that caught fire and killed hundreds of people and burned hundreds of more. And all of a sudden, Boston City is inundated with like 300 burn victims. Well, Dr. Lund, needless to say, had plenty of work for his study. So he testifies, and he basically buys the accidental thing. And he's bitter about it later on. He doesn't walk away. There are bills filed in the legislature to make it more, to relax the rules of the defense getting access to evidence, which were very strict in Massachusetts at the time. And Lund testifies in favor of these bills, and he says, I think if this case had been tried in Boston, he'd have walked out a free man. In other words, you people up in the hills there, so there were people who insisted years later, I mean, not crackpots by any means, that Noxon was innocent. There's also the thing, he filed for a new trial. I mean, everybody's convicted files for a new trial, at least in a capital murder case. But one of the reasons was they had evidence, affidavits, and a report that had been done by a social worker for the state when there was the obligatory sanity investigation going on before trial, which of course showed that Noxon was perfectly sane. But the report was damning. He had he was a bully. He was arrogant. He also had extramarital affairs, and he poached on young women and young men. These are things people are telling her around town. And I'm sorry to say that her report is 5 pages long. It's a great example of what people will say when they're granted anonymity. But
yeah.
The defense also came up with a railroad conductor who rode the trains between Boston and Albany and, chatted to people. Chatty guy, no question about it. And he talked to them about the case. What do you think about this case? And they're telling him all this stuff about terrible stuff about John Noxon, a lot of which substantiates, does a rumor substantiate another rumor? Anyway, it matches what the social worker had been told. And the defense says, look, We're not saying any of this is true, naturally, but that's what people are saying. And so our client couldn't get a fair trial. And of course, Alberti said, well, if this is so bad, why didn't you ask for a change of venue to another county? Well, they hadn't. And the judge denied the motion. But there's this whole undercurrent about Knoxon was very successful. If you needed a lawyer for a real estate or a corporate matter or whatever, and you had enough money, you needed him bad enough, you'd probably hire him. But apparently, nobody liked him very much. So there's that whole issue. Was the jury poisoned? I mean, the judge kind of throws up his hands at this and says they all were examined by me. They all took an oath. They all were examined by me on the voir dire to become jurors, and they all said they didn't have any pre-existing prejudices toward him or anybody else or contact with anybody else in the case. What can I do? Well, that's a good question.
One of the things that you touched just briefly on was the fact that it was an all-male jury, and bringing up the stigma associated with having a baby that had Down syndrome and sort of what happened with the child. And I don't feel like any of those outcomes were good, and they were all in conflict with what it appeared the Knoxons were attempting to do, right? They weren't going to send their baby to a hospital, and they weren't looking for alternatives at that point. Do you think so? My thought was, I wonder if how much the jury's own confirmation bias played into, or maybe their potential confirmation bias played into their decision, having put themselves in his place and thinking, well, I would probably have done that. And then I wonder what difference having a woman or women on the jury would have made.
Well, that's a really good question. And one of the archaic measures of Massachusetts jurisprudence at that time was women were not allowed to serve on juries. And many states and the territory of Alaska, dozens of states had women on juries. Massachusetts was dragging its feet. Yeah, it's a really good question. Had there been one or more women on the jury, what would they have thought? The men were older. During the war, the jury pool was probably average age in the 50s, maybe a little older, because the young guys were all, not all, but a lot of them were in the military. They weren't available. It's interesting because none of the judge, gives the obligatory thing when he bids the jury goodbye. Look, I can't tell you not to talk to the press or the public, but you really shouldn't. And apparently none of them ever did. I cannot find anything. But they left behind some evidence of their feelings. And the deputy sheriffs, and, my experience was deputy sheriffs can never keep their mouths shut for very long.
Mine too.
Scooped up the ballots they'd used, and they made 4 ballots. On the first one, it was 9 for first-degree murder, 2 for second, and 1 for one person who abstained for some reason. And they keep balloting, and it moves and moves and moves till finally on the 4th ballot, they're all in favor. It's 11-1 for a while, and finally it's 12-0, first-degree murder. But the only options, nobody voted for not guilty. Now, manslaughter is out. That would have been a good escape hatch, but it's not available. No one voted on any of these ballots for second-degree murder. Oh no, I'm sorry. It was 10 for first. The first ballot was 10 for first, 9 for first, 2 for second, and 1 abstention. No one ever voted for not guilty. No one in that panel thought he was not guilty. They spent 5 hours wrestling over the degree of murder.
How long was the trial?
Well, the first trial collapsed
Right.
partway through. The second trial started very end of May, and the verdict came back, I think, on the 6th of, what was D-Day? On the 6th of July. So it lasted a while. It was for Berkshire County or for Massachusetts. It was a pretty long trial.
Right. And it was a very short deliberation.
Oh, nobody expected this. The sheriff was making arrangements for the jurors to go to dinner. They were all sequestered at a local hotel, and that was the way things were done in those days. And the jurors making arrangements for the deputies to take them to dinner, and they come back and say, "Yeah, we have a verdict," not knowing they were passing up a free meal.
I know, right? And like, so with all due respect to all of them, there's no way that they thought that they just needed to decide which degree, right?
Well,
I mean, it could happen.
yeah. Well, in Massachusetts then and now, the defendant is indicted for murder, and the degree is up to the jury, which is different, to put it mildly, but that's the way it is. And they is there premeditation? Is it extreme cruelty? Is there premeditation? If there isn't, but you know that even for an instant the defendant intended to murder the other person, then it's still murder at second degree. And they came back and asked that question. What's the difference? Tell us again, Judge, what's the difference between first and second? At this point, the defense knew they were screwed.
For sure, right.
And the judge reads his part of the charge again, and out they go. And then before dinner time, they're back with first degree.
And I guess because it was, a longer trial, a very short deliberation, it does make me wonder if perhaps it just never even occurred to them that it could have been an accident.
Well, they were told it could have. They were told extensively it could have been an accident. That was John Noxon's
whole
testimony.
Defense.
That was Dr. Halpern and Dr. Lund supported that, as did other defense witnesses, almost too numerous to mention.
It sounded to me like, and maybe you have seen some more information further than what was in the book, but to me it sounded like he was very busy at work. As far as it's referred several times that like the trial taking place in the same courthouse where he had been the very day that his son died, making a case, right? Yeah. And it seemed to me like of all the sort of nuances of what occurred here, he wouldn't have picked that day. And I don't know why that stuck out to me, but
he had two good arguments there. In addition to getting entangled in the court, they had part-time. It was during the war. They had a couple who lived in. They weren't servants' quarters. There was an apartment over the 3-car garage, so they lived well, but. The husband went to work for GE, a good defense industry job, and the wife left, and they hired an elderly lady to be a housekeeper, but she was only there a few days a week. And Noxon's argument was, why would I do this when the housekeeper was there? Why didn't I do it if I could do it any day I wanted, why didn't I do it when she wasn't there? And he said, yeah, I was tired. I'd argued a case in the Supreme Court the day before, and then I argued, and we had a testimony in a civil case that very day, and I was really tired. And why would I do it on a day when all I wanted to do was rest after 2 straight days in court, and the housekeeper was there? Well, that's a good argument. Good argument.
Okay, I don't want to I promise the audience there's a lot more to this book, and you should read it. But I want to slide from the book for a second, and I just want to ask some questions about you, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, first of all, you write a lot about hard facts and statistics, basically baseball, and you cover a lot of history in baseball. What was it like moving over to true crime and covering true crime this way?
Well, I'd covered true crime before I wrote any. Always been a baseball fan or sports fan, but I covered the courts before I wrote any of the baseball books. So it's just the way the court system runs. It's fascinating. A lot of it is boring. A lot of it is trivial. Well, and a lot of surprises happen. Like, I remember covering one case. It was a sordid family homicide. Daughter was killed, and the police detectives, state police detectives, who I admired greatly, a couple of them were friends of mine, and decided that one of the sons had murdered the girl. The son was defended by a really outstanding trial lawyer who later became a Superior Court judge himself. And it was a well put case that, someone else could have done it. Someone else could have done it. And we're all sitting around there saying, he did it. And the jury was out a relatively short period of time, and they acquitted him. And I called up the foreman. These are the days when you knew who was on. Not only did you know who was on the jury, but you published their names in the newspaper. Those were the good old days, I'll tell you. So I called up the foreman, and I said, "What did you think?" And he says, "Well, I don't want to say too much, but it was clear that somebody else did it."
Oh, wow.
Okay, yeah.
So, do you think they had a person?
Have the opinion that counts, and we don't.
Do you think
they were just told that somebody else did it?
Oh, so they just ran with it.
Yeah.
I didn't know if they had a specific person in their mind.
Yeah, well, I don't remember that much about the case now. It was a long time ago, but yes, Bill Simons, the attorney, defense attorney, leaned reputationally and evidentiary on I think the father or the stepfather. It's a long time ago, but I remember how it was clear the jury was not buying the prosecution's case one bit.
Was it a brother and a sister?
Yeah.
Was it a brother killed his sister?
Supposedly.
Okay, yeah, I wouldn't have bought that case either.
Apparently not, according to the jury.
Well, I was going to say I wouldn't have bought that case either, but again, I having been on a jury and gone to jury duty, it's very concerning to me. It's concerning because it was an experience, and I realized that element of the whole judicial system is our perspective on it, or perhaps our hopes and dreams of what it would be may not always line up.
Yeah.
And a lot of things can influence a jury that probably shouldn't, even to the extent that they're just really ready to go home. And they do take an oath, and that's what the judge can do about it, is give them an oath, right?
Yeah.
And I find it very fascinating, though. It's interesting. It's also, you're right, it is interesting that you used to be able to, call up the jury foreman. I mean, now you would never be able to figure out.
The only time I ever did it, it was the only verdict I ever thought it was worth doing. Because otherwise the guilties were obvious and the not guilties were obvious. And this wasn't that obvious.
Yeah, most trials are not they're not rocket science. You kind of know.
No.
So following up with what I was asking there, I think I know the answer to this, but do you have a case, because you talked about this one from the perspective of kind of carrying it around and trying to figure out what to do with it. Mm-hmm. Do you have a case that you haven't yet done that with, that you kind of hold close to your heart and so much about it, but you haven't yet written about it?
No, this was the one.
That's what I thought. I figured that would be
I
the
love
case
this
here.
thing all the way across the country. What can I say? Literally lugged it across the country in cardboard boxes. So
So,
this was the case.
in terms of writing for you, like what's kind of next?
I don't have anything current. I'm doing some back to baseball, some baseball editing, baseball articles. I have a presentation to make at a conference out here in Phoenix in March. I don't know. Every time I've written 4 books, and every time I'm done with a book, it's a lot of work, and I'm saying, I'm never going to write another book. And then something comes along. So I wait and see.
Yeah, that's a good approach. That's a really good approach. Do you find like modern true crime cases or crime cases in general, do you read about them at all? Like, do you find it interesting, or is it like too much going on in the world with the 24-hour news cycle?
No, I read about them. In fact, I guess because I've been cranked into the Noxon case, but my wife is a co-conspirator here. The 1990s TV series Homicide is back on TV. Streaming.
Yes, it's on Peacock. Yes.
We are watching. We are toward the end of season 6 with season 7 to go. And I liked it so much, I tracked down the paperback of the original book, David Simon's Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets. It's 600 pages long.
Yep.
And
It is great.
And I'm consuming it. I'm almost to the end. We're almost to the end of the TV show. We're almost to the end of the book. I don't know what we're going to do next. But,
Frank Pimbleton was one of
like
the
that.
greatest characters on television.
Yeah.
Played by the late Andre Brower. It's an amazing.
Yeah.
If somebody's looking for something to dive into over the holiday break, it's on Peacock. It's totally worth it.
Absolutely.
Do you have any pets?
We have a cat, Terrence.
All right.
Oh.
Any unusual hobbies, like things that you do that people would be surprised by?
I'm out here where the weather is warm and the sun shines most days than not. I walk a lot. I hike a lot. I walk a lot. That's my exercise. I'm try to do as much volunteer work as I can. I'm one of the people at the Red Cross. When you come in, they sign you in and send you off to the people who draw the blood, and then we make sure you get your juice and cookies afterwards. And I work for the community food bank, and particular job is fun. We're out in a rural area west of Tucson, and we have what's called mobile distribution, where people line up in their cars and somebody interviews them and checks them off what they're eligible for and writes the code on the windshield, and they come down the line by our stations. We give them bread or vegetables or frozen shrimp or whatever the food bank has put in the truck that day. So I do things like that.
That's still really cool work to be doing.
Yeah, it's fun. It's particularly the Picture Rocks Friday morning distribution, because there's a group of us who've been on it so long. We not only do we know each other very well, but we know most of the people who come down the line in their cars too. Yeah, how you doing? How you doing?
Yeah, that's a good community to be a part of, though. Like that's a very interesting way to spend time. Probably the most important question.
Yes.
What is the best way for people to support you in your work? I'm gonna put your website in our show notes so that people can click and go there. I'm gonna put a direct link to how to purchase your book in there. But like, what's the best thing that they can do to show you support and in a way that maximizes it, not just going to Amazon or whatever, unless that's what you want?
Buy the book, read the book, and leave a review. Authors have to shill for themselves these days, so
It's a hustle, isn't it?
It's a hustle. It's
Yeah.
a hustle. Also, if you don't want to buy the book, I'm not offended. Check it out of your local library. The book has shown up in about 100 that I can find so far. It's one of those things you do to amuse yourself. How about 170 libraries, including a lot of high-level college libraries and a lot of college law libraries. Well, I figure somebody somebody appreciates this in the profession. Appreciates the story.
That's
Trying
fantastic.
to get the students to do it.
Meg.
And I know with our interview, like we didn't really bury the lead, but we maintain there's still plenty to learn from reading the book.
There's a whole other
But-
part of the story.
Yeah, there really is. But I wanted to compliment you on, I feel like all of your effort was totally worth it. You did factually lay out what happened, and you leave room for the reader to draw their own conclusions from the facts.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that so much because it puts you back in a time and space, and you get to experience, which this case is an awful case, either way, whether it was an accident or whether he killed his son. You know, a 6-month-old baby died. And so that's not the great experience, but going kind of through the ins and outs of everything that happened in a way that you just know the information and you lead the reader to draw their own conclusions, however they interpret the facts. I think I really have a big appreciation for that, and I really enjoyed reading your book.
Well, thank you.
I did as well. I love smart books, and it had all the hallmark elements of things that are just amazing for me. It had a deep, dark setting in America, and it had this whole courtroom drama going on that I really appreciate as well. I'm so glad that you wrote it, and I'm so glad that you were able to come on and share not just the book, but also a little bit about yourself. This has been fantastic for me. Meg, anything else for Jim?
The type of work you did on this book is exactly the kind of thing that I enjoy consuming. I want to contribute to someday, because it is, little Lawrence's story should be known, and regardless of what your perspective ends up being, you learn quite a bit from it.
Yeah. Any other stuff for anybody? Got any questions before I sign us all off and turn this into an episode?
Thank you so much for joining us, Jim.
Thank you for taking an interest. It's been wonderful.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabrottieCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
You fall like the stars. I break things like guitars. Thick skin, no scars. We're in trouble, we took it too far. I don't want to go, but it's 'cause I'll disappoint ya. It's all I've ever dreamed of, something I cannot let go of. I hate the competition, this culture's like a gym, and I lost the motivation to get fit in your expectations.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through Patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at TrueCrimeAccess.com. Thank you for joining us.